we continue our exploration of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, focusing on the profound lessons and moral insights that can be gleaned from his life. In our previous session, we elaborate into the incident of the boycott imposed upon the Prophet Muhammad and his followers. The duration of this boycott remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from 1.5 years to possibly 3 years, though a shorter period is more likely. The Banu Hashim, in response to the severe economic sanctions, undertook a self-imposed exile, a decision we previously elaborated on. The boycott, primarily economic in nature, involved a refusal to engage in trade or marriage with the Banu Hashim. In response, Abu Talib, in a display of resolute indignation, declared that they would withdraw from Mecca if they were to be treated with such disdain, thereby leading the Banu Hashim to reside in the valleys owned by their clan. Despite the tremendous hardships they faced, Allah, the Exalted, enabled them to endure until eventually, other members of the Quraysh, moved by sympathy, facilitated the annulment of the boycott. Subsequently, Abu Talib, along with the Banu Hashim, returned to Mecca, approximately in the 10th year of the prophetic mission, about 2.5 to 3 years before the Hijrah. However, no sooner had they returned than Allah, in His divine will, decreed that 3 successive calamities would befall the Prophet. Each of these trials brought its own unique challenges, and none could be deemed greater than the others. These events, which unfolded within a span of 2 months, were so severe that the entire year came to be known as the Year of Sorrow. The first of these afflictions occurred roughly 6 weeks, perhaps even 5, after the Banu Hashim's return to Mecca, when Abu Talib fell gravely ill, signaling the onset of death. Having lived a life dedicated to supporting and protecting the Prophet, Abu Talib's final moments were marked by the inevitability of his passing, which took place in the month of Shawwal, in the 10th year of the prophetic mission. Authentic reports, including a detailed account in Sahih al-Bukhari, describe Abu Talib's death. As death approached, the Prophet Muhammad visited him while Abu Jahl was present. The Prophet urged his uncle, saying, "O my uncle, say, there is no deity but Allah, a word by which I will be able to argue on your behalf before Allah, the Exalted." However, Abu Jahl and Umayyah, who were present, persistently dissuaded him, questioning whether he would abandon the faith of his forefathers, Abdul Muttalib. Despite the Prophet's plea, Abu Talib, influenced by those around him, ultimately adhered to the religion of Abdul Muttalib and did not pronounce the testimony of faith. Observing this, the Prophet Muhammad remarked, "I will continue to seek forgiveness for you until Allah forbids me to do so." It is essential to pause and reflect here. The Prophet's role was to comply with the divine commands of Allah. Prophets do not act upon personal whims but await divine instruction. In this instance, the Prophet's deep emotional attachment led him to desire forgiveness for his uncle, even without explicit permission from Allah. Nevertheless, Allah, in His wisdom, revealed a verse from Surah At-Tawbah 9:113, gently reprimanding the Prophet. The verse states that it is not appropriate for the Prophet or the believers to seek forgiveness for those who have died in a state of disbelief, even if they are close relatives. Although the Prophet Muhammad knew that his uncle had not embraced Tawhid, monotheism, his emotions guided him to act contrary to what was appropriate, prompting this divine correction. Allah, in His infinite wisdom, revealed the verse that prompted the Prophet Muhammad to cease seeking forgiveness for his uncle. Concurrently, Allah also revealed a passage from Surah Al-Qasas, where He declares, "Indeed, O Muhammad, you cannot guide whom you love, but Allah guides whom He wills." Quran 28:56. This verse conveyed the divine decree that the Prophet, despite his deep affection, could not guide those he cherished if Allah had not willed it. According to a narration found in Sunan Abi Dawud, it was Ali ibn Abi Talib who eventually informed the Prophet of his father's passing. This account indicates that although the Prophet Muhammad visited Abu Talib during his final moments, he was not present at the exact time of his death. After persistently urging him to embrace Islam, the Prophet returned home, and it was later that Ali came to him with the news that his uncle, his own father, had passed away. In some versions, Ali even referred to his father as, "your misguided uncle," reflecting the deep disappointment he felt over his father's refusal to accept Islam. Ali's words were tinged with a harsher tone than those of the Prophet, as he bore the compounded grief of losing a father who had not embraced the faith. Hearing the news, the Prophet Muhammad instructed Ali to bury his father. When Ali hesitated, concerned about his father's status as a non-Muslim, the Prophet firmly reiterated, "Go and bury him and return immediately." Ali dutifully carried out the burial, and after his return, still covered in dust, the Prophet supplicated for him. Ali later expressed that he would not trade those supplications for anything in this world, as they provided him immense solace during such a difficult time. Another narration, which has been mentioned before, might have taken place at this juncture, although the exact timing remains uncertain due to the limited details available about the Meccan period of the Prophet's life. The chronology of events during these early years is challenging to ascertain, partly due to the scarcity of comprehensive narrations. Some suggest that the famous incident in which the leaders of Quraysh visited Abu Talib, urging him to restrain the Prophet Muhammad, occurred near the beginning of the prophetic mission. However, it is plausible that this event took place later, during Abu Talib's final days, when leaders like Abu Jahl, Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, and Umayyah ibn Khalaf made a last-ditch effort to resolve the ongoing conflict. These leaders approached Abu Talib, recognizing that he was nearing death, and implored him to use his influence to prevent an impending civil war. They proposed a truce. If the Prophet Muhammad would refrain from criticizing their idols and beliefs, they would allow him to continue his mission without interference. Abu Talib conveyed their request to the Prophet, who responded with a counterproposal. He declared that he would accept their terms if they agreed to utter one phrase, an acknowledgement of the oneness of Allah. This proposal, which encapsulated the essence of his message, indicate the uncompromising nature of the Prophet's mission to establish Tawhid, despite the pressure from his adversaries. The Prophet says, "I assured you that all the kingdoms of the Arabs and beyond would fall under their dominion." In response, Abu Jahl stood up and declared, "We will not just give you one, but 10 conditions, 10 terms, whatever you desire." At this moment, the Prophet Muhammad responded, "The single term I require from you is, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. Grant me this phrase, and I will remain silent, and in return, you will have dominion over the Arabs and non-Arabs alike." Quote, Abu Jahl, however, resolutely replied, "We will never concede to this phrase." The Prophet then turned to his uncle, Abu Talib, pleading, "Say this kalima, and I will have a defense before Allah." Abu Talib hesitated, on the verge of uttering the words. In another account, recorded by Ibn Ishaq, Abu Talib confided in the Prophet that he would have pronounced the phrase if not for the fear that his people would accuse him of only accepting it out of dread as he faced death. Despite his virtues, Abu Talib harbored a sense of pride and tribalism, clinging to the legacy of his forefathers, particularly the esteemed Abu Talib. This narrative demonstrates that, despite Abu Talib's many noble qualities, he was ultimately hindered by his pride and adherence to ancestral tradition, a form of arrogance rooted in pre-Islamic ignorance, jahiliyyah. His refusal to renounce the legacy of his forefathers, even in the face of death, reflects the complexity of human nature, where good and evil can coexist within a single individual. Abu Talib's tragic flaw was his unwillingness to relinquish his pride and acknowledge the truth, despite knowing in his heart that his nephew spoke the truth. This inner conflict is evident in his poetry, where he acknowledges the superiority of the religion of Muhammad, stating, "I indeed know that the religion of Muhammad is the best of all religions." Yet, his ego, the fear of being ridiculed for abandoning the religion of his ancestors for that of his nephew, outweighed his acceptance of the truth. The reluctance to embrace Islam was not due to a lack of conviction but was rather influenced by the fear of social stigma and the loss of his esteemed status among his people. Abu Talib was acutely aware of the prevailing legends and the profound significance attached to the lineage of Abdul Muttalib, which he, as the eldest surviving son, was expected to uphold. The prospect of being perceived as abandoning this legacy was too great a burden for him to bear, even though he witnessed firsthand the miraculous signs that affirmed his nephew's prophethood. Among these was the miraculous incident involving the treaty, where he had staked his honor on the accuracy of the Prophet's words, which were subsequently validated. Despite these experiences, he died without embracing Islam. In one incident, Abbas, the younger brother of Abu Talib, inquired of the Prophet Muhammad, "O Messenger of Allah, have you been able to benefit your uncle in any way? For he used to protect and defend you." The Prophet replied, "Yes, I have interceded for him, and he is now in the outermost edges of the hellfire. Were it not for my intercession, he would have been in its deepest depths." In a hadith narrated in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet further elaborated that the person enduring the least severe punishment in hell is Abu Talib. His punishment will consist of wearing sandals of fire, which will cause his brain to boil, despite being the mildest form of punishment among those eternally condemned. The death of Abu Talib offers profound lessons, particularly the danger of adhering to societal norms and traditions at the expense of divine truth. No matter how revered or influential one's ancestors or peers may be, nothing is more sacred than the word of Allah and the teachings of His Prophet. Those who follow the misguidance of others, regardless of their stature, will not be excused on the day of judgment. Allah states in the Quran, "We followed our leaders and our elders, but they all led us astray." This emphasizes a profound lesson, as illustrated in the case of Abu Talib. People often justify their actions by asserting, "We found our forefathers adhering to a certain path, and we will follow it no matter what." However, Allah challenges this notion by asking, "What if I bring you something that is more truthful than what your forefathers adhered to?" Quote, "As Muslims, we must not assume we are entirely exempt from such errors. Often, our interpretations of Islam may be flawed, inherited from previous generations. Some may argue, this is what my grandfather practiced, how could it be wrong? Yet, the practices of our forefathers do not constitute evidence in Islam. The only true evidence is what Allah and His Messenger have conveyed." Another significant lesson from the story of Abu Talib is the understanding that only Allah is the true Lord, the ultimate sovereign over all things. Despite being the most beloved of all creation to Allah, the Prophet Muhammad was unable to guide the person he loved most in this world, his uncle, Abu Talib. Allah declares in the Quran, "Indeed, you cannot guide those whom you love," emphasizing that the power of guidance lies solely with Allah. This narrative also affirms the Prophet's deep affection for Abu Talib. This is significant because it challenges the extremist view held by some that all non-believers must be hated. Such an interpretation is a gross misunderstanding of the Quran and Sunnah. How can one assert that all disbelievers must be despised when Allah Himself acknowledges the Prophet's love for Abu Talib? The correct understanding is that animosity towards non-believers is due to their rejection of Allah and His Messenger, not because of personal hatred. We do not harbor religious love for those who oppose Allah and His Messenger. As Allah states in the Quran, "You will not find a people who believe in Allah and the last day loving those who oppose Allah and His Messenger, even if they were their fathers or their sons or their brothers or their kindred." Quote, "This does not imply that we must harbor hatred towards non-Muslims in every aspect. We can have a natural love for them due to familial ties or other relationships, as this is part of the human experience. For instance, a Muslim man is permitted to marry a Christian or Jewish woman according to the Quran. How could such a marriage endure if the man were required to harbor hatred towards his wife? The love in such a relationship is natural and permissible, yet distinct from religious love, which is reserved for those who share the faith. Thus, Allah affirms the natural love that the Prophet had for Abu Talib, even though Abu Talib died a pagan. This acknowledgement is crucial because it shows that it is permissible to feel a natural affinity towards people due to tribal, ethnic, or national ties. However, this natural affinity must not transform into religious love, which is reserved exclusively for those who follow the same faith. In summary, the story of Abu Talib teaches us the importance of distinguishing between natural and religious love, and it cautions us against blindly following inherited beliefs without verifying them against the teachings of Islam. It has been articulated previously, that there exists a profound wisdom in the fact that Abu Talib remained a disbeliever. The rationale behind this is rooted in the notion that his position as the chieftain of the Quraysh was maintained precisely because he was seen as a true representative of Abdul Muttalib. This representation allowed him to offer protection to the Prophet Muhammad with the respect of his tribe intact. Had he embraced Islam immediately, his tribe would have deposed him, arguing that there was no longer any justification for his leadership. Thus, by remaining in disbelief, Abu Talib indirectly safeguarded the Prophet and facilitated the spread of Islam. However, one might question why Abu Talib, given his virtuous nature and fatherly role, could not have converted on his deathbed. If it was wise for him to remain a disbeliever during his lifetime, why could he not have declared faith at the moment of death? This inquiry leads to another important lesson from Abu Talib's story, the limits of human understanding in the face of divine wisdom. Human hearts may grapple with such matters, but it must be acknowledged that only Allah possesses full knowledge. While individuals may desire or detest certain outcomes, Allah knows the ultimate good and harm in all things. The inability to comprehend why Abu Talib did not convert at the final hour emphasizes the importance of submitting to divine will without question. As part of faith, believers must acknowledge that Allah's actions are beyond human scrutiny. Allah alone has the authority to ask, while His creations have no right to question His wisdom. To challenge Allah's wisdom is tantamount to the arrogance displayed by Satan, who, in his defiance, claimed to know better than Allah. Thus, true servitude to Allah involves accepting His decrees, even when they elude human understanding. The narrative of Abu Talib also underscores a significant theological point. Belief in Allah transcends mere acknowledgement of the Prophet's truthfulness. Some may erroneously define a Muslim as someone who simply affirms the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad. However, this is not an academically sound definition. Abu Talib himself believed in the truth of the Prophet's message, as evidenced by his own words on his deathbed, where he expressed his knowledge of the truth yet refused to proclaim the Shahada, fearing the criticism of his peers. This demonstrates that recognizing the truth alone does not suffice. One must also submit to it. Islam, fundamentally, is about submission, not just knowledge. Iblis, Satan, for instance, knows the truth. He acknowledges Allah as his Lord, recognizes the prophethood of Adam, and affirms the reality of the Day of Judgment. Moreover, Iblis even engages in acts of worship, as evidenced by his supplication to Allah. Despite this, Iblis is labeled as a disbeliever kafir by Allah, not because he lacks knowledge, but because he refused to obey Allah's command out of arrogance. Thus, disbelief kufr can manifest not only in ignorance or rejection of the truth but also in a refusal to act upon it despite recognizing it. This brings us to a contentious issue, the status of a Muslim who, while professing belief in Islam, fails to fulfill the obligations of the faith. What distinguishes such an individual from Abu Talib, who recognized the oneness of Allah and the truth of the Prophet but did not submit to Islamic law? Abu Talib's poetry reflects pure monotheism, devoid of idolatry, yet he refrained from embracing Islam. The difference between such a Muslim and Abu Talib lies solely in the verbal declaration of faith. One claims to be a Muslim, while the other did not, although, linguistically, the latter's stance might even appear more coherent. As for the hadith, whoever says, La ilaha illallah, shall enter Jannah, it is crucial to interpret this within the broader context of other prophetic traditions. The hadith specifies that the declaration must be made sincerely and from the heart, with a genuine commitment to the tenets of Islam. The conditions attached to this statement are not merely verbal affirmations but encompass a lived adherence to its implications. Abu Talib's story illustrates that theoretical belief, devoid of practical application, is ultimately insufficient for salvation. Furthermore, it is important to clarify that translating Iman as faith is a misinterpretation, as Iman is a multifaceted concept that extends beyond mere belief. One could argue that Abu Talib and even Iblis possessed a form of faith, as they both recognized certain truths. However, this recognition alone does not equate to being a mu'min, a true believer. Iman encompasses not only belief but also submission and adherence to divine commands. Another significant lesson from Abu Talib's story is the peril of associating with corrupt individuals. His close companions in his final moments were Abu Jahl and al-Walid ibn Utbah, whose influence and the weight of his ego ultimately prevented him from embracing Islam, despite his inclination to do so. This underscores the importance of carefully choosing one's companions, as they wield considerable influence over an individual's actions and decisions. Additionally, it is essential to note that the death of a non-Muslim relative does not preclude Muslim family members from participating in the funeral proceedings. Ali initially hesitated to bury his father, believing that his status as a non-believer absolved him of any responsibility. However, the Prophet Muhammad instructed him to proceed with the burial, emphasizing that one may attend the funeral of a non-Muslim relative, assist with the processions, and even contribute financially, provided that they refrain from participating in religious rituals incompatible with Islamic beliefs. This incident further demonstrates that Muslim relatives can take charge of the burial process for non-Muslims, as Ali did for his father. The Prophet's correction of Ali's misunderstanding affirms the principle that one may attend the janazah funeral of a non-Muslim relative, provided they do not engage in any religious ceremonies that contravene Islamic principles. Another point of historical interest is the composition of the Prophet's paternal uncles. Of the 10 brothers excluding the Prophet's father, who were the sons of Abdul Muttalib, 7 passed away before the advent of Islam and, therefore, never heard the message of monotheism. The remaining 4 uncles either accepted or rejected Islam. Interestingly, those who rejected the faith, Abu Talib and Abu Lahab, had pagan names, while those who embraced Islam, Hamza and al-Abbas, bore names with noble meanings. Both Hamza and al-Abbas are names associated with strength, each symbolizing the lion, an animal revered in Arab culture. This linguistic and cultural nuance further enriches the historical narrative surrounding the Prophet's family. Al-Abbas's name connotes bravery, yet both Hamza and al-Abbas are names symbolizing the lion. Interestingly, those with names embodying purity and virtue embraced Islam, while those with names associated with idolatry, such as Abu Talib and Abu Lahab, remained entrenched in their pagan beliefs. Whether this is a manifestation of divine decree or something else, only Allah knows best. Nevertheless, it remains a noteworthy observation. Regarding the Prophet's aunts, a common question arises: how many aunts did the Prophet Muhammad have at the time of his birth? Although some may speculate as high as 7, most scholars agree on 6. Of these 6, only one, Safiya, is confirmed to have converted to Islam. Another aunt, Atika, witnessed the dawn of Islam and famously had a prophetic dream before the Battle of Badr, which we will discuss in detail in the coming lessons. As for the others, their stories remain shrouded in mystery. Some suggest that more than one aunt converted, while others posit that several passed away before Islam's advent. However, the lack of historical records suggests that most, if not all, did not embrace the faith, as their conversions would have been documented. There is a final point to address concerning Abu Talib. Some Islamic groups assert that he died a Muslim. 2 such groups exist today, the Shia and certain Sufi sects. The Shia, for instance, consider it a grave insult to suggest that Abu Talib died outside the fold of Islam, as they hold him in high regard as the father of Ali, the first Imam. They argue that it is inconceivable for the father of the Imams to be a non-Muslim. However, we counter this claim by citing the example of the Prophet Ibrahim, whose father was a known idolater, yet this did not diminish Ibrahim's esteemed status. There is no textual evidence to support the claim that Abu Talib converted to Islam. The second group includes some Sufi circles, and a segment of scholars argues hinges on the notion that because Abu Talib performed the nikah, marriage contract, for the Prophet Muhammad and Khadijah, he must have been a Muslim. They reason that otherwise, the marriage would have been invalid. This argument, however, is deeply flawed and based on a misunderstanding of the pre-Islamic customs. Despite the fervent beliefs of these groups, the overwhelming evidence, supported by Quranic verses, hadith, and historical records, clearly indicates that Abu Talib did not die as a believer in monotheism Tawhid. Following the death of Abu Talib, the Prophet Muhammad endured another profound loss, which in many ways was even more devastating, the death of his beloved wife, Khadijah. Ibn al-Jawzi notes that Khadijah's death occurred within 40 days of Abu Talib's passing. Abu Talib died at the beginning of Shaban, while Khadijah passed away on the 10th of Ramadan, a mere month and 5 days later. At the time of her death, the Islamic rites for funeral prayers, Salat al-Janazah, had not yet been revealed. Thus, no formal prayer was performed. However, the Prophet Muhammad personally took charge of her burial, entering the grave himself to lay her to rest. Several companions observed that, following Khadijah's death, the Prophet did not smile for several months, as her loss was deeply traumatic. The deaths of Abu Talib and Khadijah marked a profound period of sorrow for the Prophet. Abu Talib had been a father figure and external protector, while Khadijah was not only his beloved wife but also his closest confidant and unwavering supporter within the household. The passing of these two pillars of support contributed to the overwhelming grief that characterized this period, which later came to be known as the Year of Sorrow. The virtues and blessings of Khadijah have been extensively extolled in numerous traditions, and the Prophet Muhammad harbored an immense and profound love for her. Even Aisha, despite never having met Khadijah, felt intense jealousy because of the Prophet's enduring affection for her. This sentiment was particularly evident when Khadijah's sister, Hala, visited the Prophet in Medina. Hearing Hala's voice at the door, the Prophet, who was half asleep, became visibly excited, momentarily mistaking her for Khadijah. Aisha, witnessing this, was overcome with jealousy and later remarked to the Prophet, using words that reflected her youthful emotions. At this, the Prophet's demeanor changed. While he may have overlooked the earlier remarks, clearly upset him. He responded by defending Khadijah. She believed in me when no one else did. She spent her wealth on me when everyone else withheld theirs. She comforted me when the world gave me grief. And through her, Allah blessed me with children, a blessing not granted to any of my other wives. After this incident, Aisha never again spoke ill of Khadijah, having learned the depth of the Prophet's love and respect for her. The accounts of Khadijah's virtues are numerous, and we could continue to explore them. However, for now, we shall turn to the events that followed Abu Talib's death, which brought significant political challenges for the Prophet. Abu Talib had served as the Prophet's protector in Mecca, and his death left the Prophet vulnerable. As Ibn Ishaq recounts, after Abu Talib's passing, the Quraysh intensified their harassment of the Prophet, no longer restrained by Abu Talib's influence. This period also witnessed the infamous incident where 6 or 7 Quraysh elders conspired to desecrate the Prophet during his prostration in prayer by placing a dead carcass on him, an act of profound disrespect that epitomized the increased hostility the Prophet faced in the absence of his uncle's protection. Amidst the mounting tensions, Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab were prominent figures among those opposing the Prophet. In a previously mentioned incident, when the Prophet was in prostration, Uthman ibn Abi Mu'ayth, having ventured out of the city, returned with a repugnant load, the entrails, blood, and waste of a slaughtered animal. He then callously hurled this filth onto the Prophet during his prayer. This event, initially discussed in the context of early Mecca, finds greater resonance here. Notably, Abu Talib was no longer alive to shield the Prophet, and no one intervened to reprimand the perpetrators. With no protector, the Prophet stood up, his body sullied with blood, and invoked Allah, saying, "O Allah, I complain to you, for there is no one else. You deal with Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, Walid ibn Utbah, Abu Jahl, and Abu Lahab." Remarkably, within 2 to 3 years, by the time of the Battle of Badr, all 7 of those he named met their demise, underscoring the profound timing of this incident, which seems more fitting after Abu Talib's death. Before this, an intriguing episode involving Abu Lahab suggests a momentary shift in his demeanor. Following a particularly harsh rebuke of the Prophet by a Qurayshite Nod of the Banu Hashim, Abu Lahab, who had assumed leadership of the clan after Abu Talib's death, seemed to develop a fleeting sense of responsibility. It is crucial to understand that with Abu Talib's passing, Abu Lahab, the eldest surviving son and a staunch pagan, became the de facto leader of the Banu Hashim. His authority was undisputed, as neither Hamza nor Abbas, both Muslims, could assume this role, and Abbas was still quite young. In this capacity, when he heard about the rebuke directed at the Prophet, Abu Lahab approached him and said, "O Muhammad, continue as you did during the time of Abu Talib. The privileges you had then, you shall retain as long as I live." It is evident that this protection stemmed not from affection for the Prophet but from a sense of duty as the clan chieftain. Abu Lahab, now responsible for the tribe's honor, found himself compelled to act differently under the weight of leadership, a common human reaction when one transitions from boasting to bearing actual responsibility. This change in behavior is often observed. Before assuming power, individuals may speak freely and make grand claims, but once burdened with real responsibilities, they are compelled to act with caution. Before Abu Lahab ascended to power, his animosity toward the Prophet was overt, yet, upon becoming the Banu Hashim's leader, he adopted a more restrained posture, telling the Prophet to continue as he had under Abu Talib's protection. This shift in Abu Lahab's stance led to rumors among the people that he had converted to Islam. When confronted, they asked, "Have you become a Sabian? Have you accepted Islam?" To this, Abu Lahab replied, "No, but I am protecting my flock." Though he denied embracing the new faith, he felt an obligation to protect the tribe's interests. However, Abu Jahl and Utbah, the most virulent of the Prophet's enemies, conspired to undermine Abu Lahab's protection of the Prophet. They devised a scheme to provoke Abu Lahab by suggesting he question the Prophet about the fate of his father, Abdul Muttalib, a revered figure whom Abu Lahab was ostensibly protecting by shielding the Prophet. When Abu Lahab asked the Prophet about his father's fate, it was a carefully laid trap. The Prophet, displaying profound wisdom, responded cautiously, saying, "He is with his people," thereby avoiding a direct confrontation or inflammatory statement. The Prophet's response, "He is with his people," was intended to be non-specific, but Abu Lahab misinterpreted it as a favorable sign. When Abu Jahl learned of this, he chided Abu Lahab for his naivety, clarifying that, "with his people," implied a dire fate, as the Prophet's statement alluded to his being in the fire of hell. This revelation incited Abu Lahab's fury. He could not accept that the Prophet would declare his father's fate so harshly while he, Abu Lahab, had been shielding the Prophet in Abdul Muttalib's name. Consequently, Abu Lahab renounced his protection of the Prophet, and within a week, Abu Jahl orchestrated his expulsion from this sanctuary. Thus, the Prophet was left without protection in Mecca. In the absence of his protection in Mecca, the Prophet turned to the neighboring city of Ta'if, seeking refuge and support. This transition marked a significant phase in his efforts to find a safe haven.